They thought the war was over. Not because anyone had officially said it. Not because there had been a surrender signed or a celebration announced. They thought it was over because the guns had gone quiet. And in war, silence can feel like mercy, can feel like permission to hope. For 3 days, there had been no artillery, no distant thunder rolling across the hills, no machine gun fire cracking through the night, just wind whispering through tall pine trees and snow settling softly on frozen ground. The kind of quiet that makes exhausted men believe the worst has already passed. The Ardennes forest stood like a wall along the horizon. Dark, dense, endless. Pine trees packed so tightly together that even daylight struggled to reach the ground beneath them. In winter, it felt alive in a way that unsettled the men stationed near it. The branches sagged under the weight of snow, bending low, creaking softly, as if the forest itself was breathing. Private First Class Daniel Mercer stood near the edge of an American defensive line, his boots half buried in frozen mud. His rifle rested against his chest, the metal cold even through his gloves. Every breath came out as a slow white cloud. He hadn't slept properly in days, but compared to what he'd endured earlier in the war, this felt like a pause. The officers called it a quiet sector, a rest assignment, a place to hold the line while other units pushed deeper into Germany. Daniel had heard that word, Germany, and it sounded close, final, like the last chapter of a long, brutal story that everyone wanted finished. Some of the men were already talking about home, Christmas dinners, warm kitchens, clean clothes. One man swore he could already smell his mother's cooking if he thought hard enough. Daniel didn't join in. He had learned something since landing in Europe. War doesn't end when you want it to. He stared into the forest again. It stared back, dark and unmoving. The Ardennes didn't feel defeated. It didn't feel empty. Felt like it was waiting. The cold cut through Daniel's coat, sharp and unforgiving. He shifted his weight, adjusting his stance, eyes sweeping the tree line for the 100th time. Somewhere behind him, a soldier laughed quietly. Another struck a match and lit a cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind. Normal sounds. Too normal. Daniel remembered the hedgerows of France, the sudden ambushes, the way the enemy seemed to rise out of the earth itself. He remembered thinking he had learned his lesson then. War never announces itself. It arrives. Just after midnight, something changed. First, Daniel thought it was the wind. A subtle movement among the trees, barely noticeable. Branches swayed where moments before they had been still. Shadows shifted in a way that didn't feel natural. He leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. The wind wasn't strong enough for that. He raised his binoculars slowly, fingers stiff from the cold, careful not to make a sound. He focused on the forest ahead, scanning the darkness inch by inch. That's when his stomach tightened. The shadows weren't random. They were moving together. Dark shapes blended perfectly with the trees, advancing in slow, deliberate steps. Pine branches were tied to helmets and shoulders, breaking up human outlines, turning soldiers into part of the forest itself. Rifles were held tight against chests. Heads were low. No shouting. No rushing. German infantry. Advancing. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His heart slammed against his ribs. These weren't scattered remnants. These weren't retreating units. This was an attack. He lowered the binoculars and spun around, adrenaline flooding his body. "Contact!" he shouted, his voice ripping through the silence. Forest line. For half a second, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. Men scrambled out of foxholes. Rifles were grabbed. Helmets snapped into place. Officers shouted orders that collided with one another in the darkness. Someone tripped. Someone cursed. A machine gun was dragged into position, metal scraping against frozen ground. And then the forest answered. Tracer rounds ripped through the night, red lines tearing between the trees. Mortars thumped, sending shells screaming overhead before slamming into the earth with bone-shaking force. Trees splintered. Snow exploded into the air like smoke. The Germans surged forward, screaming now, firing as they came. The silence died instantly, replaced by chaos so loud it felt physical. Tanks followed behind them, engines growling, crushing trees beneath their tracks, as if the forest itself was being torn apart from the inside. Daniel dove into his foxhole as an explosion slammed into the ground nearby. Dirt and snow rained down over him. His ears rang. His hands shook as he pulled the rifle tight against his body. They thought the war was over. It wasn't. It had been waiting. German forces poured out of the Ardennes in numbers no one expected. This wasn't a small push. This was everything they had left. A desperate gamble to break the Allied lines and force the war back in their favor. Fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the battlefield. Allied aircraft were grounded, blind, and useless. Roads clogged with retreating units, supply trucks, and wounded men. Radios crackled with overlapping orders that made no sense anymore. Daniel fired until the barrel of his rifle burned through his gloves. He saw figures fall and rise again. He saw friends drop and not move. He heard men screaming for medics who couldn't reach them because the ground between was nothing but death. The forest burned. Trees shattered and collapsed. Snow turned gray, then dark. The smell of smoke, oil, and blood filled the air, sticking in Daniel's throat. By dawn, the American line had bent but somehow not broken. Barely. Orders came to fall back to a small village farther west. Daniel and the others moved through the snow under constant fire, dragging the wounded, leaving the dead behind because there was no other choice. Every step felt wrong. Every retreat felt like betrayal. The village was already in ruins when they reached it. Stone walls blown open. Roofs collapsed. Smoke curled from shattered windows. Civilians were gone or hiding underground, praying the war would pass them by. Didn't. They dug in again, set up defenses, tried to catch their breath. And again the forest moved. Days blurred together until time stopped meaning anything at all. Night and day lost their edges. The cold never loosened its grip. Snow kept falling, covering tracks, bodies, blood, and shattered equipment as if the earth itself was trying to forget what was happening on its surface. Daniel no longer remembered when he had last eaten a full meal. Hunger had become a dull, constant ache, like the cold, like fear. It was just there now. The village became a trap. German artillery found its range and began pounding the streets methodically. One building after another collapsed into rubble. The ground shook so often that Daniel stopped flinching. His body had learned there was no point. He moved when ordered, fired when told, reloaded automatically. Survival had narrowed his world down to simple motions. Somewhere nearby, a medic screamed for help. Somewhere else, a man begged God for mercy. Somewhere else, a prayer was cut short by an explosion. The German loudspeakers returned at night, their voices echoing through the fog. Americans, you are surrounded. Lay down your arms. This war is over for you. Daniel listened from behind a shattered stone wall, rifle resting across his knees. He wondered how many of the men around him believed that voice. How many wanted to believe it. Surrender meant warmth, food, sleep, life. But surrender also meant giving up the men beside you. And that was something Daniel couldn't do. The tanks came again just before dawn. They appeared out of the fog like moving buildings, massive and unstoppable. Panthers first, then tigers. Their engines roared low and deep, vibrating through Daniel's chest. Shells slammed into the village at point-blank range. Walls disintegrated. Foxholes vanished. The street turned into a storm of fire, dust, and screams. Daniel ran with a bazooka team through drifting smoke, slipping on ice, lungs burning. They crouched behind the remains of a bakery, its sign hanging crooked above a pile of rubble. The smell of burned flour mixed with smoke and oil. A tank emerged at the end of the street. It filled Daniel's vision. The bazooka fired. The rocket struck the tank's rear, erupting in flame. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Cheers burst out, wild and desperate, as the tank shuddered and stopped. Then another tank fired. The explosion tore the street apart. Daniel felt himself lifted off the ground. The sky flashed white. Sound vanished completely, replaced by a pressure so intense it felt like his head might collapse inward. When he came back, he was buried. Darkness, dust, pain. He coughed, choking, clawing at debris with numb fingers. Every breath burned. His ears rang violently, a high-pitched scream that drowned out everything else. He forced himself upward, breaking through rubble and collapsing into the open air. The street was gone. Smoke filled everything. Fires burned uncontrolled. Bodies lay scattered in the snow, twisted and still. Some wore American uniforms, some German. It didn't matter anymore. There was no front line, just survival. Daniel stumbled forward, vision blurred, grabbed a rifle from the ground. He didn't know whose it was. He didn't check. He moved because stopping felt impossible. He fired at shadows because shadows were all there was. The snow kept falling. Men froze where they stood. Literally. Found days later locked in place, eyes open, weapons still clutched in their hands. Frostbite took fingers, toes, entire feet. Medics worked until their hands cracked and bled, then kept working anyway. Chaplains whispered prayers faster than bodies could be buried. Daniel watched a friend collapse crying because he couldn't feel his hands anymore. Watched another stare blankly at the stumps where his boots had been, shock hollowing out his face. The forest loomed nearby, silent again. Watching, waiting. Then one morning the sky changed. The fog thinned. Light broke through. And with it came a sound Daniel had almost forgotten. Engines. Allied planes roared overhead, their silhouettes sharp against the blue. Bombs fell. The ground shook again, but this time it felt different. Supplies dropped from the sky. Ammunition, food, hope. Tanks arrived from the west. The pressure shifted. Slowly, painfully, the German advance stalled. The forest stopped moving. When the fighting finally eased, Daniel sat on a crate in the snow and stared at his hands. They wouldn't stop shaking. He pressed them together hard, trying to force them still. He was alive. Thousands weren't. The Ardennes lay shattered behind him. Villages reduced to rubble. Forests torn apart. Fields littered with the frozen dead. The surprise attack meant to change the war had failed, but it had carved itself into the men who survived it. Months later, Daniel would cross into Germany itself. He would see the enemy surrender for real. He would hear the official announcements, the speeches, the word victory spoken aloud. But none of it would feel as real as that night in the Ardennes. The night the guns were silent. The night the forest began to move. That was when Daniel learned the truth. War doesn't end when you want it to. It waits. And when you let your guard down, it comes back. Quietly, patiently, through the trees.